Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by our team mental health counselor, Rick, and we're going to talk about breakups. Mm-hmm. So this is a theme, it just had been coming up in my life in different ways, knowing people who had been breaking up. And, we have done a lot of podcasts on relationship topics, which are so, so important. I think so many people get value out of them. But I thought about it, and we hadn't really done a podcast on breakups. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think most people can attest to this being one of the hardest things in terms of obviously when you're getting broken up with, that's generally speaking, there's not a breakup where it's like, hey, we're just both mutually done with this. There, of course, are times where that happens, mm-hmm. but I would say, 98% of the time, my fake statistic, but probably most of the time, someone is going to want to initiate it and the other person is going to be very hurt by it. Mm-hmm. But there's still, of course, the person, even if you are initiating the breakup, you're still going to be hurt. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be in a different way. So breakups all around are really hard. But of course, sometimes it is for the better for a lot of different reasons that we're probably going to discuss. So mm-hmm. I'm interested to get into this from a psychological perspective and not just a pop psychology kind of, mm-hmm. Whatever the hell is rampaging TikTok nowadays with advice. So this will be real, actual, solid psychological advice from a therapist on breakups.
Well, so yeah, this is an unfortunate byproduct of dating. And not just dating, but connecting to and attaching your life to another person. Breakups are not specific to any particular age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. It crosses every boundary and barrier that we have. And at the end of the day, no matter where you're from or who you are, it hurts. And there's, breaking up is probably one of the most difficult things most people will encounter in their life. And what I've seen from it is that it mimics in many ways the same response that we have when we have a death in our life. Most people are pretty familiar with the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief and loss, which those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so what does denial look like? Denial is this inability to accept the reality that this person no longer wants to be with you or that they've ended the relationship with you. Anger can look like a lot of different things, everything from, slashing tires to, talking about how much they hate the person, to fits of rage, just being even irritable or annoyed or frustrated, their tone, their personality can change. Bargaining oftentimes looks like, well, maybe if I do this and if I change this, or if I was really listening, maybe I could have done this better or done this differently. And if I do this, then they'll come back to me. And then, depression is a fairly common one that most people will experience usually initially. Sometimes denial happens at first, and then depression usually is the one that is the most painful for people to work through. And the thing I also want people to understand too about these stages of grief and loss and stages of breaking up with somebody is that you can go through all of these stages with the exception of acceptance really at once. You can vacillate between them. You might be angry one day and then the next day be really sad and then find yourself kind of negotiating or bargaining with yourself. And then, go back to angry and then go back to depression. So you can kind of bounce back and forth between these. You might even get to a space where some days you're totally okay accepting the relationship and you're okay, I'm fine. I'm really great. I'm totally over this. And then see something, hear something, be in a place and then be thrown right back into it. So just understand that this is a process. Unless you totally checked out of the relationship, months before it ended, you're going to feel a certain way about it because breaking up is really hard. And one thing, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kick you. One thing that you said that I really appreciate you saying is that even the person who's doing the breaking up, the person who's saying, hey, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, they get hurt too. And a lot of times people don't like to admit to that side of it because when you're the person, when I've been broken up with, it's hard for me to feel like anything other than the person who's been victimized in this particular space or the person who's been hurt. And I'm You mean, well, and here's my favorite. Well, if it hurt you and you're really bothered by this, then why did you do it to begin with? Right. And so sometimes it can reopen that negotiation, that bargaining that kind of comes with it, but sometimes it's not so much about the why a relationship ended. It's just that it is dealing with the idea that the relationship ended. And I think what makes it difficult for people too on a different level is that even with death is kind of a final thing, right? Like, it happened. This person's no longer here. I'm really sad. I'm going to grieve this, but then I move on. With a relationship, relationships have an ending, but there's the knowledge that one day this person's going to find somebody else and move on. And so that can be hard. And we're not just grieving the loss of the relationship, but we're also grieving the loss of that person from our life and from the future that we've created, either together or in my mind. And so that hits on a deeper level, which is why when you enter into a relationship with somebody, you really want to make sure that you're doing it from the right spaces, because if you don't, even if every relationship, with the exception of the one that you're in for the rest of your life, usually comes to an end, and it's always hard.
Yeah, it's hard no matter what. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, like, when you were talking about those stages of grieving, would you agree, and maybe I'm incorrect here, but that some people can go through that before the relationship is over? And like you said, like, somebody's maybe already checked out because they've already gone through these things. And then when they do break up, like, some people will be like, oh my God, how did you move on? Or how did you do this? It's like, listen, I was already going through all of this before. Mm-hmm. And then now it was just kind of like finalizing that. So I think that this, like, the time frame of this, and like you said, you can kind of oscillate between all of these feelings. Like, this is all normal for the person who is being broken up with, and also the person who is initiating that. And this all comes back to, and I think that the overarching theme of a lot of the relationship podcasts that we have is taking this kind of mature stance on, like, when you are going into a relationship, of course, like, again, sometimes they are going to end no matter how great your intentions are. Like, that's not, most people's end goal. But I think that there are people who, especially when you are younger, like, you get into relationships and maybe you aren't thinking in that capacity. Mm-hmm. Whereas, like, as you mature and you get older, it's like, okay, I need to make sure that I'm in the right place to give a lot, because, like, all the podcasts that we talk about, like, this is like a lot of work. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that in a negative connotation at all. Like, it's a positive thing, because there's a lot of benefits to having a partner, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work. And you have to be realistic with yourself and with the other person of, like, I am not capable of giving this in a relationship right now. And I know that this, whatever all that is what is needed to make this like last. And I think that some people, like, will take that selfishly, right? Like, I've been on both ends of those, like, saying that or also being on the other end of it. And it's like, it really hurts when you're on the other end of it. Like, but ultimately, if that person isn't in a position, the other person isn't in a position to actually give enough to the relationship, well, them being honest before things even really escalate to a deeper level, months or maybe even years in, like, is honestly, like, the best thing. And obviously that's not even talking about breaking up. That's talking about, like, the getting together. Like, I do want to say that.
There was an old saying in Vietnam that it was like, you talk to some of the veterans and they were like, if you were going to die, it was better to die in the beginning of Vietnam than it was at the end of Vietnam, because then you didn't have to suffer as much. So I think sometimes you can start with the best of intentions. And I think most people do. And let me also put a caveat out there. There's a difference in breakups. And what I mean by that is there's a difference between the couple who breaks up because of disagreements or growing apart or emotional distance or, like, a change in values, versus relationships that end as a result of affairs and abuse. And so I don't think all breakups are equal, because they're not. And I've seen people break up after just a few months and still be just as devastated as a person who's ending a 20-year relationship. And so sometimes it's not even about the quality of the time that you guys spent together as much as it is, sometimes what you thought or believed the relationship was going to become or would one day be isn't. And so that hurts, and it's not to be taken lightly. And I think sometimes one of the dismissals you'll hear from people is they're like, well, you were just dating this person for like a couple of weeks or a few months or whatever it was. And it's like, that doesn't mean that they didn't have higher hopes for that particular relationship. And, and so I think sometimes if you can be at least honest enough with yourself to say earlier in the relationship, if I know that this isn't, what is going to become my lifelong relationship, to end it then. Sure, I agree. It's better to end something after a few months than to wait like several years and then end it later. But at the same time, don't underestimate the pain that's going to be caused by it.
Oh, for sure. Like there's always pain. But I guess just like a mental note that I've made as we're going through a lot of these podcasts is that like there is a lot of effort and work involved in relationships. And I think that there are still some people who maybe take the viewpoint that it's not. And that's where a lot of these, I think, breakups can occur. And there's a lot more pain that happens that maybe is unnecessary. And until people actually realize like, man, am I actually ready for this? Or just being honest with like, this is what I'm ready for. This is the capacity that I have. Are you on board with that? Do you want less? Do you want more? And obviously that's hard to talk about in the beginning, but I think that it's super important to discuss because everybody's going to be in a different place when you meet them. And like, yeah, going on a few dates is great. And like getting to know someone is amazing. But then, okay, like now what? Right? Like, here's what I can give. Like, what are you ready for right now? What are you interested in? And like, that's always the challenging conversation. But I think that could save a lot of like this heartache that we're going to talk about. It's still going to be hard and it's still going to hurt. But I think that just being honest with yourself, that does take a certain level of maturity and understanding, but I do think that that's super important.
Yeah. And, life circumstances can also start playing a role into what you thought you were ready for and what you weren't. And so like you might think I'm ready for this and I can do this. And then you start getting into it and you can quickly realize like, oh crap. Right. And this is where, and I'll kind of reference this later, when you go back to, and you think about some of the other podcasts we've done on like theories of personality, and like we're talking about Carl Jung and like the shadow, and kind of the essence of the shadow is learning to, for the other person, for all of us, is learning to accept and see the fallibility in other people, how flawed we are, right? Not just our imperfections and that we don't handle things perfectly, but sometimes we do hurt people. We are capable of doing things. And so the idea of understanding that side of this is also recognizing that sometimes relationships aren't ending because the other person's terrible or awful or mean or because they were cruel and insensitive. It just means that I can accept the idea that like, okay, this relationship is ending and the things that happened in it, I don't necessarily have to hate this other person for what they've done. Like I can see in them and understand and accept how they were fallible, how they mishandled this or mistreated me or did these things that were wrong. And I don't have to spend so much time feeling hurt when I can recognize that their actions, while hurtful, are still part of the human spectrum, right? And so it's a little bit of like disconnecting emotionally from that person and saying like, okay, because here's one of the things that I see, and this is where I'm going to spend the majority of it, and I'm going to give you guys some tips and things to do. But what ends up happening a lot of the time is when a person is going through a breakup and they're the person being broken up with, there is a tendency to vilify the other person, right? And what I mean by that is, I don't just mean like painting the person as evil, but what I mean is they put so much of their time, their energy, their attention into the person that broke up with them, rather than by spending your time and effort and energy on you, on healing. And so I think sometimes what gets lost in a breakup is you spend a lot of time focusing on the other person and not enough time on yourself. And I don't mean in yourself in terms of making yourself like a better human being, but I mean like focusing on what I need to do to heal from this relationship instead of staying in this hurtful, emotional space. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And would you say that some people probably do that because they're thinking, okay, well, if I change this or if I focus on that, then maybe we'll be able to get back together? Do you see that as a common thing, or is that different?
That to me seems a little bit more like bargaining.
Okay.
Right? Like if I'm like, well, if I change this or if I do this differently, maybe they'll come back to me. And so I'm holding on to the hope that maybe this person's going to come back. And maybe they will. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think you really need to dissect the relationship and understand, like, what did the person say? how final is this, right? Is this a kind of common trend for them? Are you guys the kind of couple that like break up and get back together and, and this kind of stuff? So it's difficult. Or
is this like, hey, like this is just not the time and this is, more final.
Yeah. If it's more final, like, and and they know, and it's been said, then the amount of time and effort people put into worrying about the other person is just time that's not spent working on yourself and healing yourself. Because if you focus on, if you focus your time and attention on other people, then you're just staying stuck in the same space. And you're not growing, you're not changing, you're not evolving, you're not getting back to a space where you can fall in love with somebody else because your hurt feelings still exist over the previous relationship. And that's where processing through all of those emotions from the past relationship become, really relevant. And if you're not doing that and then you're jumping into another relationship, like you're not giving yourself or that other person a chance for that relationship to be a success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of going back to that first comment I meant, like pre-relationship, mm-hmm. right? Like where are you even entering this from? Like where is the space that you're entering this from? Mm-hmm. And the way that people define dating now is so different and unique. So, they might not even care. It might just be super casual for them as well. But that's where understanding, okay, like where am I at? What capacity do I have to like give to someone? And then just being, pretty honest in mm-hmm. terms of that. So a lot of times you said people will vilify the other person and spend a lot of their time focusing on them.
Which is normal to a certain extent, because I think part of that is the anger phase, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
Like, and we've got to give that its space.
Yeah. Even the person I would imagine who is who is breaking up with the other individual, they're also remembering all of that, like, oh, this is why I broke up with them, or this or that, like they're, mm-hmm. it's not like they're just like, most people don't just break up with someone and like wash their hands of it. Like they're thinking of those things as well, but in a different kind of light, mm-hmm. right? Or no?
Yeah. Okay. I think reasonable people are doing that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What
would be an unreasonable response?
Kind of the people who are more pathological.
Oh, who just don't give a fuck.
Who just don't care, or who are being cruel to be cruel, or, they're playing games or doing whatever that is.
Yeah.
And the lesson that I think one of the things that I would definitely tell people is, even if you're the person who broke up with somebody or you're the person who ended the relationship, you have your work to do too. And I think sometimes, like, it can be, if the person's breaking up, sometimes people will have the mindset of, well, I'm breaking up with them, so the majority of the things were wrong with them, right? And the other person who's being broken up with might be like, well, I did nothing wrong, everything was this person's fault. Okay? And so for me, because I've been on both sides of this too, if I've ever ended a relationship with somebody, that to me is more hurtful than actually being broken up with. Me personally, I carry that with me for a really long time. It is not something that's easy for me to get over. It's much easier for me, and I don't know why, to rationalize somebody else not wanting to be with me than it is for me to have to reject somebody else in that capacity. Or to just say, like, look, this isn't it. And I think part of what makes it so hard for people on the breakup side of it is you get into a relationship and you want to give the other person the best version of you. And what I've recognized is I didn't give them the best version of me. Like, so even though I might have ended the relationship, the hardest part is being honest with yourself later and recognizing, like, fuck, like, I didn't go through the pre-checklist and do everything that I should have done. I wasn't in the best emotional space. I wasn't as attentive. I didn't give or respond to bids in the right way. I wasn't as great at communicating. I wasn't as open or as intimate as I needed to be. And the list goes on. And so that part of it for me is worse than somebody being like, yeah, Rick, this relationship isn't going to work. I don't like you anymore. Here are some things. It's like, okay, I'm going to be hurt and go through those steps, but I rebound much faster from that than I do ending the relationship, because it usually means too that I'm also coming to the realization that this person's not going to be a part of my life anymore.
Would you say that in your experience with counseling that it is predominantly that way, or is it the other way around?
Usually when people are coming to counseling, it's because they've been broken up with.
Okay.
So I see that side of it a lot more than I do the person who's
Yeah.
coming to me being like, look, I broke up with this person and I'm feeling like shit over it.
True.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to say.
But I do see that a fair amount in counseling where, in sessions where people are talking about something and they're like, I feel really bad about the way that this relationship went, or I feel terrible about how things ended with this person. And to that, I say, like, okay, like, we can talk about that. Like, this is the opportunity for us to grow, and this is the only way I can think to help people understand this. And this is the way I've personally carried it within myself, is that if this person meant something to you, right? If this relationship or the value of this other human being meant something to you, then the only way sometimes that you can pay homage to that relationship or show them the value that they have is by doing the work now to not repeat the same mistake later, right? Because inevitably, if you guys can wrap your head around it, especially the ones who are going through the breakup right now, I know right now that might seem impossible, right? If you're hurt, if you just ended a relationship with somebody and you're in that space where you can't see the future with anybody else, no one else is attractive to you, like, I get it. Like, in time and enough work, you will eventually feel differently. I promise. I know right now it seems impossible. I've been there. I think everybody has been there at some point in time. But eventually there will come a point where you've moved through the anger and the depression and the bargaining and you're in acceptance. And what that means is you can wake up and, like, suddenly you'll start to see somebody new. You'll start to feel attraction. You'll want to put yourself back out there. You'll open yourself back up for love again, even though right now it feels impossible. You can do that. But I think for me, the people who have struggled, and even in myself, is to say, like, okay, where did I go wrong? What did I do? Mm-hmm. Because it's not just like, okay, the relationship didn't work out. What part of me failed that relationship? Mm-hmm. And that's like a dagger to my heart when I'm like, fuck, like, how did I fail this other person?
Yeah. But like you said, you have to do that in order to not repeat that, mm-hmm. because you don't want to do that to somebody else and you don't want to feel that way for yourself mm-hmm. again either. So it's beneficial for really everybody involved. It's just really hard, especially kind of in those early stages. Mm-hmm. But I think that, yeah, a lot of times, and again, this maybe is just more of like kind of a mature outlook on things. And this is not just mature in terms of age. I mean, it can be, but just in general, like, I don't think a lot of people really go through, like, people have an idea of what they're interested in, mm-hmm. In terms of like, oh, I like this or that. But like, okay, what are you actually looking for in a partner? Mm-hmm. And what type of partner do you actually want to be? Because those two things are super important. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe everybody else does this and kind of missed the boat on that at some point. But like when I first started like really digging into that, I was like, man, I mean, of course I've thought of certain things, but never really like sat down and was like, all right, what are these things? Like, mm-hmm. what am I looking for? Who do I want to be as the partner? And I think that if people are able to do that, they're going to be able mm-hmm. to really be able to go into things. And again, hopefully not break up, but let's keep it on. Okay, I know now we're going on different stuff in terms of finding a partner. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about breakups. So say somebody got broken up with, mm-hmm. right?
What are some things they can do?
Yes. We're like, okay, before you break up. No. Okay, so it's already happened. Mm-hmm. Okay, on whether the circumstances were your fault, their fault, both faults, moved apart, whatever it might be. What are some things that you, as the individual who has just been broken up with, can do?
Okay. So first and foremost, there's no real, I haven't read. If I'm wrong, please feel free to send it to me. Any research papers that really identify from an empirical evidence-based perspective, like these are the best ways to get over. Like, yeah. Go to YouTube, you'll find 1,000 videos, yeah. right? On like, here's how you get over it. And so I think there's some things that generally lend itself toward a healthier perspective in processing through a breakup. And so that's where I'm going to, I'll give you some guidance. One of the things that I like personally and both professionally is for you to journal or write a letter, kind of a final letter. Because I think sometimes, and if you can't have the letter, maybe perhaps you can have a conversation with that person. Because I think there's things that need to be said in order to move on in the relationship. or not in the relationship, but ending the relationship and moving on in your life.
This is if you've been broken up with.
If you've been broken up with, yes, these are things to do. So write a letter. How do you feel? Everything that you want to say, everything that wasn't said.
Are you writing it to them, or you're just writing how you feel?
You can, and there's no sense. It's not saying that you have to even send it.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I just meant the context is you're just writing about it, or you're writing what you would say to them.
I usually write it to the person, and I would instruct people to write it to whoever it was that you've broken up with,
been broken up with.
Excuse me. And so you just start saying what needs to be said, venting your frustrations, your emotions, saying everything that you can without a filter. Then it helps to read that letter once or twice or 22 times or whatever it is that you need to do to read it to yourself to make sure that it came out. Because what you're starting to do is you're starting to process all the things that are trapped inside you that you've wanted to say. And if you can't do it in a letter, do it in a phone call with the person. Sometimes you need to take weeks, months, a year, 10 years, whatever it is, and go back and have that conversation. Hopefully it's not 10 years. That's a really long time to be grieving the loss of a relationship. But writing a letter to the person who broke up with you is generally a really healthy way to start the processing of your emotions and to get things out. And what you recognize is the act of finally saying everything that you've wanted to say is cathartic in and of itself. Then share it with a friend if you need to, or bring it to your therapist, or read it out loud 100 times if you need to until you get tired of hearing those things. Because what this does is it avoids you going back and forth into the bargaining phase, right? I'm saying everything that I need to say and I'm getting it outside of me, period. And if I can't do it in a letter, I'll do it in a conversation. Have the conversation. Text the person, be like, hey, I want to talk, and say what I need to say, and then say it, and then move on.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the hardest parts is that when you are in that shut out period, when you feel just really misunderstood and I didn't get my point across, and some people are receptive. Yeah, let's talk. And other people are just no, we're just left on red. So I think that this is a really good idea to kind of you're able to get all that out and not everybody is going to give you that space to say those things. And even if they did, here's the way that I try to think through this. Even if they did, they might not even be willing to hear it. So does it really matter if you say it to them or if you just get it out, Great
point. Are you saying these things to change their mind, or are you saying these things to process your emotions so you can move on? Very different motives. Very different. And so if you're approaching
and also it has a different feeling behind it, because if you're only saying that well, maybe they'll understand finally, that's going to feel very different when they don't reach out or they don't answer versus if you're you know what, I just want to get this out and it's said, and maybe they're just not in the place to hear it, and that's okay. Those feel very different, emotionally.
Yeah.
So
completely. So write a letter, have a conversation. Sometimes removing objects from your house can be a really cathartic process. That could look like taking down pictures. It could look like perhaps things that the other person bought for you, removing items from the house that might remind you of them.
Yeah, trigger memories, or not going places that maybe trigger those memories. When we used to go here together, or this was our thing.
Well, then the next one I was going to say, sometimes you need, or a healthy step is going to those places and saying goodbye to the memories, right? Where did you go on your first date, right? And maybe going back there, or where you got married at, or perhaps your favorite spot where the two of you used to go, and having a little ritual there and saying goodbye to that spot, ending that relationship. Okay. Understanding too that yes, being back there can be triggering and can bring back a flood of emotions, but remind yourself that your motive is not to get the person back. Your motive is to heal. And it's fundamentally important.
How do people change that? Because I think that's probably where most people struggle, is that if they're well, if I could change someone, or if I could change myself, or I could change the situation, then it'd be different. Then they'd totally see that this is going to work. I think that maybe I'm wrong, but I feel that's probably where most of the hurt is feeling well, if I did this, or if they did that, or if they just got it, this would work. But in reality, it's never usually that one thing. But that I feel is where a lot of the hurt stems for people. So how do they change that perspective?
You're stuck in the bargaining phase.
Okay.
That's just negotiating with yourself. You're like, if I could just change this, then they would see.
Yeah.
That's negotiation.
If I didn't say that, then this wouldn't have happened. You're like,
if I didn't say that, if I didn't do this.
Yeah. It's like, well, it probably would have at some point.
And very well.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the part where it's like, am I still working from this to save the relationship and capture the person back, or am I working to move past the breakup? And the hard part is we all want the relationship back, and we don't want to move forward. And so the reluctance is always to figure out ways to go back and fix it, because we're really good at fixing things when they're already broken, rather than fixing them before they got broken.
Listen to our podcast episode before this. But really, that was like a good pre-podcast to this one, because that's where like a lot of those, like that's where a lot of that contempt and like separation builds, is from what we talked about on that episode, on like, the creating the connection. And then now, like you said, a lot of people want to fix things afterwards, but it's like, listen, like this has been going on for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Like this isn't just like, most people don't just wake up and they're like, fuck this bitch. Like you're I mean, some people, maybe some, some
you're a different person if that's the case.
Yeah. Then you maybe have some other issues, but most people are not going to be doing that,
Right.
It's going to be this like long, slow process. So.
Yeah. And catching, like, how do you avoid, something like, how do you avoid a car accident? It's like, well, you don't avoid the car accident when it's inches from hitting you. You avoided the car accident by like doing the 5 or 6 steps before. So that's where, the other podcast comes in. But for now, it got to this point. And, and sometimes, there are things that happen in relationships with people where it's just not designed to work. And you're fundamentally different people, or something has occurred where it's like, it's not something that you did. It's something where I'm at or where you're at that I know isn't going to work. And so whenever that realization comes in, it comes in. And so sometimes there's really nothing that you can do to change the relationship, because in doing what you can do to preserve the relationship sometimes means changing too much of who you are as a person. And it's like, at that point, who were they in a relationship with? This fake version of you or me? Yeah. So that, like, obviously sometimes people grow apart because they haven't been doing those things to stay connected, but sometimes people do genuinely change in these ways, in the direction at least that they want to go, or maybe they finally realize, like, like this is what I'm actually interested in. Like, I want to do these things and you want to do these things, and that's okay that they're different, but like these are kind of fundamental things of how we want to live. And this isn't like, oh, I voted this way, or I did like nothing like that. Like it's like, it's just general like life trajectories of like, this is where I want to go, this is where I want to go, and maybe those things are separate, and that's kind of that like growing apart thing. But yeah, I would say probably a lot of people, at least in my experience, really struggle with breakups emotionally because of, it's like, well, what could I have done? Or what if this one thing, if they just understood? And like you said, that's kind of that bargaining phase. But what if somebody's been in a relationship where maybe someone, like, not necessarily diagnosed with, narcissist personality disorder, but being with someone who maybe is like more manipulative, right, in some capacity, and they, like, everybody else can see, like, oh my gosh, we all see that this person is not good for you, this relationship is not good, but you're so like hooked on them, maybe even for like the wrong reasons. How does that person get out of that stage? Because I feel like that's even, like, it's already hard, but then I feel like in that sense, it's really, really hard because they're so addicted to that like chaos and that like push pull that it's like, that's their norm. It's their norm to break up and get back together all the time. Even when you know that it's like, it's not healthy. So how would you recommend somebody going about that? Obviously they have to have the awareness that that's even happening, right? Like, you could tell someone until they're like a million times, but they have to obviously recognize it themselves. But yeah, so when you're dealing with somebody who has a slightly deeper pathology or they're highly manipulative, you kind of need to understand some of the specifics that's happening within the relationship. But oftentimes some of the more broad strokes is, I've referred to the Karpman trauma triangle in the past, which is victim, persecutor, rescuer. I find myself reiterating this a lot with clients. And these are 3 different roles that a person essentially fulfills in a relationship for somebody, oftentimes when the relationship is unhealthy. And so what happens is one person assumes the role of the victim, right? And in being the victim, I'm placing my partner as the persecutor, the person who's causing me these pains. And so what that sometimes does to people is it makes them shift into thinking, I can rescue this person. And this is where the mindset comes from when you're talking about people who are like, if I could just change this, if I could just do this. They're really coming at it from this rescuer perspective. Like, if I was just different, if I said things differently, if I acted differently, if I did these things, then this person wouldn't have walked away. And generally speaking, if you're a normal, relatively normal person, you're going to do and say things that are wrong, and people are going to have to forgive each other in order for a relationship to exist. But people who are really toxic or unhealthy or highly manipulative, they're assuming they're placing you as the persecutor so that you assume the victim role, so that you stay trapped in these cycles, these unhealthy cycles where you're like, it's my fault, or I've got to save this person, and so their instability almost becomes your responsibility. And guess what?
And what you're drawn to.
Sure. And those relationships can be intoxicating because they come with such highs and such lows. Where most relationships kind of keep this, baseline level with little peaks here, little peaks there, peaks and valleys here and there. But with, some of these more toxic, unhealthy people, like, it can be like they can love bomb the shit out of you and make you feel like you're the greatest thing in the world, and then the next minute be trashing you. And that instability is like, how do I get back to that goddess level? How do I get back to that godlike level? How do I maintain? And some people have this capacity to think that, like, I'm the one it's my job to love them through all of this, right?
Yeah.
I can't tell somebody when or where or how to end the relationship, right? You will decide when that's enough, when enough is enough for you. And I've known people who are in relationships for years of their life, and they've been through it all: abuse, physical, psychological, affairs. They've been through horrible situations of mistrust and betrayal, still in those relationships. And then I've seen people be in those relationships for years and finally end them, and then find a really great relationship later in life. How you decide to get out of that is only up to you, because some people will really commit themselves to the idea that, like, oh my God, if I love this person, it's my responsibility to love them no matter what happens. And it's like, that's great. But at what point do you recognize that a relationship is a two-way street and that person has to start giving back to you? Because if they're not, then you're being this kind of martyr for the cause. And I don't know who asked you to do that. That's your kind of position.
Yeah, and that's really hard because there's like this fine line with everything, right? But especially with relationships of like, all right, like there is a give and take, I need to be committed. I need to like stand by this person. I need to do all these things. Like those are all like stand-up qualities, but it's really hard to see when you're in the midst of that, like how toxic that person the other person might be, and you think like, oh, I have to, and then the problem is when, like, as the outside observer, you can see how that person is manipulating your friend or whatever. And it's so heartbreaking. But like you said, and that's what I wanted to hear you say, like, you can't make that person get out of that relationship. And like, it doesn't matter how much you berate them, how much you talk shit about the other person. Like, it doesn't matter. And what's really sad though, is that in these types of, really kind of toxic relationships, like a lot of times that person will make that person feel so isolated, you know what I mean? And then like the friends are kind of like, I can't hear about this one more time, you know what I mean? Like I need a distance for myself. So then they do literally become isolated. So then that toxic person is like, see, you are the problem. And then it kind of feels, so it's so hard because it's like, you want to help that person, but it's like, oh my gosh, like, can you not see this? But when you're in the midst of that, and especially like that emotional like grip that they have on you, it's so hard.
Yeah.
But you said it, like that individual has to be the one to decide that. And hopefully you have good people in your life. And if you're listening to this and you have a friend or, family member who's in this, being supportive, but, being supportive of them when they're going through those lows, but also trying to, get that person to recognize, hey, here are some of the things, but not say it in this like rude way. Like, yeah, he's such a piece of shit, or this, like every time you do that, that person is, they're not going, right? Would you say this is like backed up psychologically? Like they are not going to respond that way. If you're like, oh my God, like, so-and-so is so awful. I don't even know why you're still dating him. Like, they're not going to be like, oh, you know what? You're right. I should break up with him. Like, no, they're not, that's going to even feel more like they just don't get it. Like, I can change him or her, but it's like, no, like if you say, the more you say that, the more that they're going to like dig their heels in. At least that's the experience that I've had.
Yeah, generally speaking. And then the other back part of that is if they stay with that person, now they know how you truly felt about them. And so now they're going to be like, well, I don't want to go talk to Lauren anymore because I know Lauren hates this person.
Yeah. So that becomes...
Now it's problematic.
So it's like, okay.
I liken it to this. This is the best example that I can give. You ever try to convince an addict not to use drugs or drink? And it's like, well, how do they decide? When they decide. When they've had enough, experienced enough pain, or are sick and tired of being sick and tired, whatever kind of cliche thing you want to use, that person ultimately makes the decision to commit to sobriety. And here's the thing, that commitment to sobriety is going to look different for every single person. But until you're ready to walk away from that relationship, you're not ready. Maybe you need to be cheated on 20 more times. Maybe you need to be hit.
Or they find someone else to latch onto, and then hopefully then they kind of go away.
I mean, you want to avoid hopefully moving from one abusive relationship to the next.
No, I mean the toxic person could maybe also be tired of you and then just move on. That's hopefully what could happen as well. And
when you're dealing with like people who are like slightly more narcissistic, what ends up happening is because the narcissist doesn't necessarily connect emotionally to the relationship, it's much easier for them to move on. And then here's the best part. They move on very quickly while you're still struggling with the emotional turmoil. And here it makes it even worse. Every person who's been in a relationship with a narcissist says the same thing. They're like, I know if I break up with him, my biggest fear is that he's going to move on to the next relationship and be really great. And initially he will be, because he's going to love bomb that person until the relationship evolves long enough where it can't get past the superficiality of it. And so all of those things are going to come full circle. And so like your worst nightmare kind of comes true, but then that person didn't do anything to really change. And so all that's going to happen is a new relationship with the same dynamics is going to exist.
It's so tough. But when you're in that spot, it's really hard.
None of that stops you from loving the person.
No. So, taking these steps, if you are in that position, is important. But what about if you are the person who is like, what are some, I guess, signs? And again, this is going to be different for everybody, but like, what are some signs if you're the person who's like, man, like, I don't think this relationship is working anymore, and you're the person who's going to pursue ending it? Like, what are some things that maybe are happening that are kind of clear signs, if any, that like maybe this is no longer the relationship for us?
This is also done on an individual basis, because one person's ceiling is another person's floor. What you might end a relationship for might be like, it's just a Tuesday for me. But like, I think if you don't want to be in the relationship anymore, first and foremost, if you're starting to envision your future with somebody else or without that person, if that person creates kind of a visceral response in you that is uneasy, if you feel like you can't trust or be open or vulnerable with this person anymore, it might be time for you to really start giving consideration to what this relationship looks like. I've seen people do this shit where they like do like a pros and cons list. Like, well, these are the great qualities, these are the good qualities. I know I just said that in a really judgmental tone, so let me backtrack a little bit. Fine.
How you say things is everything.
Yeah.
It's not the words.
Thank you, doctor. You're right. Touche. But
so Rick doesn't like pros and cons lists. Got it.
Because I think it takes it to this really, it takes the emotion out of it, and it makes this like, it's very cold and calculating. And I don't know if relationships are meant to be cold and calculating.
It's just kind of like someone can fit all the criteria on your list, right? But then you don't really feel it. So you're like, it's the same thing. It's like...
And confirmation
people
bias
aren't like a walking list.
Plays a role in that, right? Like, I might highlight some of the things, because if I'm wanting to stay in the relationship or end the relationship, I might focus more on the negatives. And then what happens? What happens when there's an equal amount of positive to negative? Yeah.
But being reflective and introspective in some way is probably important. So if you haven't done that, like if you're just having, a rough couple weeks, maybe don't just be like, pull the plug on this, but really sitting down and being like, what's upsetting me? Like, what reactions am I having? Is it when they do one specific thing, or is it all the time? Or is it our paths are different? Like, so I do think that maybe not a pro and con list, but maybe a introspective list, or I guess thoughts
to reflect on the relationship and to highlight some of the most important and critical aspects. Yes. And so again, it's one of those things where for some people, and I've seen this, for some people, they'll come into a session and they'll be like, I know I should end this relationship, but I'm not. And I'm not going to. And they're like, okay, because like they just kind of feel comfortable enough in it. And for some people, the devil they know is worse than the devil they don't. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of ending a relationship where I know how to navigate it is much more terrifying than the prospect of dating somebody new, because in their mind, it could be worse. Mm-hmm. It could be a lot better.
It could be a lot better, or it could be a lot worse. You're right.
We won't know that until you take those risks. Yeah. But I think sometimes the reason why the list thing doesn't always work is because there's an emotional piece to a relationship that can't be summed up in just, one thing. You can talk to people who have literally, their spouses have beaten them and they still love them. It's like you can't necessarily beat the love out of somebody. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, I could tell that person, hey, maybe you should consider leaving, and obviously when there's cases of physical abuse and harm, like it becomes a little bit more of a safety issue, but you still don't know. And I don't want to get too far down this hole. I can't make that decision for somebody because I have no idea how that's going to affect them. I had a professor once, he's like, he was talking about a personal story. He advised a woman to leave somebody who was physically abusive to him and the child. He said, you should absolutely leave. And then she showed up at his office and was like, I have nowhere to go. He's like, what about money? She's like, well, he has all the money. And so it created this, like, I'm not saying stay in an abusive relationship, but I'm also saying there's complexities to things and to why a person should or shouldn't leave a relationship, which is why it's really important for you to make that call. And I don't know sometimes if there's, like, if you can look at a list of events that have occurred and say yes or no, this person should be in my life or shouldn't be in my life. I think it comes to that feeling space where you look at it from a reasoning perspective as well as an emotional perspective and use that wise mind, where it's the creation of both to make the decision both emotionally and mentally. Does it make sense for me to leave? Am I feeling emotionally like this is the right thing for me to do? There's a ton of red flags that can be occurring. And so evaluating those red flags is really important.
Yeah, I guess all that is super useful. The only hard thing, again, is if somebody is in maybe this kind of more toxic situation where they think everything is great except for these few little things, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the, I guess, emotion piece is probably hard, because emotionally, they feel okay about it, but
well, and are those things problems for them or are they problems for you? Right? You're listening to the person's story, and if you're like, oh my God, that's a problem, but it's not as big of a problem to them. Fine. But if they're at least, let's for argument's sake, saying they're voicing this as a problem.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Is it a big enough problem for them to leave?
Yeah.
For them to brave everything else that's going to come with leaving, or is it worth it? Because sometimes you'll also hear, and you've heard me say, you've got to choose your hard, right? Being in a relationship is hard. Making a relationship work is hard. Ending a relationship is hard. Breaking up is hard. Going through a divorce is hard. Choose your hard, and that's an easy phrase to say, but a hell of a thing to live through. And so it's very difficult. But a few other things that I want to get to, unless is there something else that you wanted to add on that? No. Obviously, go ahead and create your breakup playlist, right? No, I mean, for some people,
isn't that everybody's everyday playlist? I listen to the most emo shit.
They process emotions through music. Music is a very emotional thing. It can help. I think sometimes if you even create a playlist that reminds you of that person and you listen to those songs over and over again,
that's the worst. What the fuck advice is this, Rick?
When you start listening to the music and you get sick of hearing the damn song, you're usually moving through the emotions.
That shit hurts. Music hurts so much.
Yeah, it does.
Right?
Yeah, it does.
Here's another. I swear, Spotify knows. So I'm like, I'm in a sad mood, and it just picks all them. Why are you picking all these songs today? Today is not the day.
Here's another little tip that you guys can use to get over or help you get over your relationship, and it's giving yourself and allowing yourself specific times of the day to grieve. So when I'm going through a breakup, I will encourage people to say okay, it's especially in the beginning, I'll say you can give yourself 2 or 3 times a day to process your emotions. So you're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to read the letter or whatever it was, and you're just going to feel every emotion. And I want you to bawl your eyes out. I want you to listen to the sad songs and sing and think about the future and all that. But you're going to give yourself a timeline. Okay. I'm going to do this for a half hour. Okay. And then at a half hour comes when that alarm goes off. I'm just like, okay, I'm going to take a shower. I'm going to get ready for work, and I'm going to go throughout my day. And now if you need to do this, like maybe you schedule it during your lunch hour, and then maybe you schedule something again in the evening. But what ends up happening is throughout the day, when you find yourself thinking about that person and it's not one of your allotted times, you utilize the technique of thought stopping and thought switching. I'm thinking about this person. I'm thinking about them. I'm feeling, okay, I'm going to stop that. Picture the stop sign in your head and start thinking about other things that you can be doing. Okay. And then later that night, when it's like 7:00 and you're home alone and the door is locked, like pour your glass of wine, get your sad music on.
Get that playlist going.
And crank it up again and get in touch with those emotions. And what I have found is when people are doing that, when they're actively focusing on something during the day and then allowing themselves times at night to process their emotions, it gives them more structure and they don't feel overwhelmed by emotions all day.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that time stop is so crucial, because I think what happens is, you know, a lot of us know intuitively, like, all right, I need to go through this kind of emotional release. But what ends up happening is that it can just kind of spiral and like stay with you, right? And then it kind of like colors the rest of the day. Like, let's say it is in the morning, you know, and then it just kind of like keeps on going. So I definitely think that having those designated times and also like the stop times to be like, all right, we're going to pack this up for right now, and then we can revisit it later. But I think that that's so important, because otherwise it's just so easy to spiral. Like, all right, I was going to go here and do this, and then well, I'm going to keep crying, and now I'm driving, and oh my god, and then and then you keep staying sad. So I think that that's so critical, because I think a lot of people maybe understand that first point, but don't understand like how to round that out. Yeah,
and you can start to, reduce the time too. Like if you're like, I'm going to start with a half hour and then go to 20 minutes and then 10 and then.
And if that sounds like a lot, like, listen, think about how much time you actually waste thinking about the other person in these unproductive patterns. It's much more time than that.
Oh yeah.
If you're like, you didn't know what I mean? Like, it's not like, oh, you need 3 by 30 crying out. Or like, yeah, because if you're not having a handle on it, like, it's significantly more time than that. Like,
and crying, by the way, is one of the most healthy, best ways to get through your emotions. Like, if you've got tears, like, stop fighting them back. Like, let them out. The snot bubbles and all the other stuff that come with it, like, let it out. Because keeping it trapped inside you is only going to hurt you and perpetuate the pain that you're in. And so it's kind of like you have a choice. How much you're going to be in pain. How long you're in pain is dependent on what you're doing now. And then here's one other point that I would really like to talk about, and then, ask or answer any questions that you may have. When you're moving through and you're healing yourself, and I've said this, I said, focus on healing yourself, not necessarily what the other person is doing. Put your time and energy, like, don't think about like, well, we broke up and now I know this person's out doing these things and they're with this person or they're with these people, and they're like, you're focusing on them. Focus on you. And so what I mean by that is there's a difference between self-improvement versus distraction. Okay. And so what is self-improvement? Self-improvement is learning. Self-improvement is traveling. Self-improvement is advancing your understanding of yourself. It's growing as a person, learning a new skill, taking a new class. It's joining a club or some sort of social event or whatever it is. Versus distraction, which can oftentimes look like getting drunk, hooking up, submersing yourself into work. When you look at those things, the difference between distraction and self-improvement is I'm tapping into parts of me that matter. I'm learning new things. I'm growing as an individual. I'm learning about myself. So I'm focusing my attention, my effort, and my energy on me. Versus distracting, which is temporarily helps me go numb, right? But doesn't actually do anything to address those things. And if you spend more time in distraction, all you're going to wake up with is hangovers, more disappointment, prolonged pain, and you're not actually advancing and learning and bettering yourself. And I think sometimes it can be confusing because people are like, well, isn't joining a new class kind of a form of distraction? In a sense, it is, but you're not distracting yourself from the person and replacing it with something unhealthy. You're investing in yourself. And who doesn't feel better when they learn something new, right? Like when you develop a new skill, or you're taking interest in something that's always been an interest of you, or you're traveling. Like, the restorative nature of travel is amazing. And what you're also doing too is you're creating new experiences that don't involve that other person. So there's this new version of you that's being created. There's this person that doesn't know what it's like to go here or do these things or this side of you. And so there's a big difference between self-improvement versus just distracting. And I can tell you, like, get rid of the old adage, like, how do you get over somebody? You get under somebody else. Like, get rid of that. That's only going to lead to more disappointment and hurt feelings and, regret later on.
Yeah. I was going to say that's probably like, that's like the feel good in the moment, like, adage, right?
Sure.
Like, yeah, let's go get drunk and let's go out and hook up and meet these people. Like, yeah, but how many times do you wake up and you're like, man, totally over my ex now? Like, the chances of that happening are slim to none. Like, maybe in that moment you're not thinking about that, but then in a few hours, when you're home alone again, like, it doesn't change any of that. And hey, listen, like, we're not saying, like, don't go out and have drinks every once in a while. Like, that's not what we're saying, of course. But there is a huge difference, and I'm so glad that you touched on that, because distraction is so easy, because you're like, I want to do anything but think about this person. You know what I mean? So, like, let me scroll, let me watch something, let me go out, let me be busy. And then, or work, that's such an easy one for people to do. Like, I'll just work more. But yeah, are you doing anything to better yourself? And the best point, I think, out of all that is, are you creating these new memories and new experiences, like, just for yourself, and maybe with other people too. Like, maybe it's some solo, maybe it is with other friends or other people, but it's not with that person.
Right.
So I think that probably is certainly one of the best key points out of that, is to really not distract yourself during this period. And really focus on, bettering you. And also, like, you touched on at some point, like, it has to be a level of ownership with the relationship, right? Like, in terms of, like, okay, like, nobody here was perfect, like, the person who broke up with you and you who got broken up with, like, both of you played a role here. Obviously, sometimes it is much more one person than the other, so I'm not going to say that it's not.
Correct.
But there is always a level of, like, hey, what did I learn from this? What could I do better? And what do I not want to do? Like, maybe this person brought out some things that I don't want to act like that again. Like, maybe I don't want to be like this or present myself this way. And so taking that time, like, for yourself to really invest in yourself and figure out, like, all right, I don't want this to happen again, or I don't want to be like this anymore. All of that is going to take time. And then I guess final question, and there's obviously no right answer here or not, I'm just curious. Do you see, like, a trend? And I know you're going to say, well, it's an individual. Of course, everything depends. I know that every question is, it depends. But is there generally, like, a time course that kind of makes the most sense in terms of dating again? Or is it really like, no, it is totally case by case dependent? There's not really a trend here. Like, obviously wouldn't recommend breaking up with someone and then getting into another relationship in a week or two. Like, clearly that's not going to happen. But do you see anything? Have you seen any patterns, I guess is kind of what I'm asking, in therapy? Or is it really just all over the place in terms of healing and when is best for someone to date again?
Well, what I can say is you have a much, much higher chance of failure if you jump right into another relationship without learning or growing. And that can be, like, especially within a few weeks. So if you've just broken up with somebody, even if it was somebody you were just dating for a few months, and now you're already dating somebody in a new relationship, and it's just been like a few weeks, like, good luck. I'm not saying it's going to fail, but, like, that has a very high probability of failure because of the fact that, and I mean, and so there's so many intangibles, right? Like, did the last relationship really mean anything to you if you're getting into another relationship?
You checked out, months before. Like, I know there's a lot of nuance. I just was curious if there was maybe something that you saw or no.
No, I mean, I've seen some people say, like, for every year you're in a relationship, it takes a month to kind of process through that. So, like, 3 years, 3 months, 10 years, 10 months, that's still, like, to each their own. I know people who have been in, 5-6 year relationships, and it's taken them like a year or two to really rebound and get back to just an emotionally healthy space for themselves, let alone opening themselves up to somebody else. So unfortunately, no, I wish I had a better answer for it, but
there doesn't need to be a better answer. I was just curious if there was I figured there wasn't, but I was just curious for, like, man, I see this over and over again, but I figured it was a no because it's every relationship is so different. And like we said, there were some people who are already checked out before they actually even break up. So, there's that. And then there's the person who is, totally blindsided and grieving and thought they were going to get married. I mean, there's so much nuance to like, what is a breakup? But, ultimately I think that that's a great response. You need to invest in yourself. You need to really actually heal and not just go and date. Dating can also be a distraction. Right?
Absolutely.
So don't just
hookups,
think even if you're not hooking up, even if you're just going on dates, because it's exciting to be texting someone and making plans and all that. Like if you are putting your focus there, you're now probably not going to have the space for that in your personal development and your work and your other relationships. Like there's only so much time in a fucking day and so much cognitive capacity that you can give. So
here's okay. So perhaps this is a better way to think about it, not in terms of time, but until you've worked through each of the stages, until you're truly in acceptance, that's the time where it might be okay for you to start to date. Because the reality is, if you're angry at a person, and for however long it takes to move through that anger, if you're doing things, whether it's lashing out at that person, trying to hurt them, or showing them by sleeping with other people or dating other people, whatever those reasons are, you're coming from this space where all you're really going to do is create regret for yourself. And no one likes to be angry. No one likes to be sad. I don't know many people who enjoy those emotions. Denial is kind of a different thing. Most people kind of get through that a little bit, and then they start processing through these emotions. So until you're out of those phases, however long that is for you, stay single long enough to get out of that phase and get into acceptance. Because then in acceptance, it's like, I don't have to act out of a space to hurt that person. I don't have to act out of a space of hate for that person. I don't have to become a different person or do things that might compromise who I am or where I'm trying to go. So get to the space of acceptance before you're at least open to a new relationship, and avoid the whole friends with benefits thing. Like, I get it. I know sex is an important part and people want to feel that physical connection. But oftentimes when you break up with somebody, what you're really longing for is the emotional connection and the lack of intimacy that has been removed from your life. And replacing it with casual sex doesn't necessarily fulfill that. I think too often we tend to look for sex to replace too many aspects of the relationship and intimacy, which intimacy could be a whole nother topic. But so maybe that helps. Like if it's within a few weeks, perhaps we should examine how far out you were removed from that relationship to begin with.
I think that's a good framework of looking through, okay, maybe I am ready to date again. And then, you can also change your mind. You can go on a date or two and then be like, you know what, I'm actually not ready. And then be open and honest with that other person. And again, that kind of goes back to that, like pre even really getting together, like where are you? And just being really honest in terms of that. So I think those were really great suggestions. I know this is like a kind of a shitty topic. Nobody wants to hear about this, but everybody has gone through a breakup and everybody has probably initiated one and felt one. So I think that being able to have some of these tools and this perspective is going to be really useful for people moving forward. So hope you guys enjoyed this episode. As always, we really, really appreciate if you do share. This is the best way that we can grow the show. If you're interested in reaching out to Rick for counseling, either solo or couples counseling, what is your email? FullCircleTherapyFL@gmail.com. Great. And then for information on one-on-one coaching and the services that we offer, you can visit teamlocofit.com. And if you're interested in learning more about our app, which has macros, meal plans, grocery lists, training programs, mental health resources, all of the things, it is our next best thing to coaching. You can visit redefinehealthyapp.com and learn more there. So thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you next week.